Most people hear the phrase compound interest and immediately picture a happy ending. They picture a clean little line on a chart bending upward forever. They picture discipline, patience, maybe a modest monthly contribution. And then one day, almost magically, they picture themselves rich. Albert Einstein supposedly called compound interest the most powerful force in the universe. I do not know if he ever said that. I do know that millions of people have built their financial hopes around the sentence anyway. And I understand why. It is one of the most emotionally satisfying ideas in all of economics. You save a little, it grows, then the growth grows, then the growth on the growth grows. And if you wait long enough, your money appears to develop a life of its own. That is the promise. Work hard, save regularly, stay patient, and eventually the curve turns upward so sharply that all the sacrifices start to look worthwhile. I want to tell you something uncomfortable. That story is real enough to be seductive, but incomplete enough to mislead you. And if you do not understand what is missing, you will misunderstand not only why most people never become rich from compound interest, but also why whole societies can become poorer, even while the rich keep getting richer. So let me start by being fair to the idea before I dismantle the mythology around it. Compound interest is powerful. If you invest £1,000 and earn 10% a year, the first year gives you £100. The second year, you are no longer earning 10% on 1,000. You are earning it on 1,100, then on 1,210, then on more than that over time. Each year's increase becomes larger than the year before, not because you are working harder, but because the base itself has become larger. That is what people mean when they say the process is exponential. If I draw your wealth, compound interest does not look like a straight line. It starts gradually, then bends upward, then bends harder, and eventually gives the impression that wealth can almost escape gravity. That image is intoxicating because it feels like a moral promise. Be prudent now, and later life will reward you. Resist consumption, and later consumption will become effortless. Sacrifice in your 30s, and abundance will find you in your 60s. And behind that story sits a bigger idea about society itself, an idea which is also partly true. Why can individuals earn these returns at all? In theory, because the society around them is also becoming more productive, more tools, more factories, better, more total wealth. If society compounds its productive capacity, the individual can ride that upward motion through savings, investments, and ownership claims. Economists love to explain this with what I think of as the desert island fantasy. Imagine you wash up on an empty island. In the first year, you do the absolute basics. You secure food in the next year because you are no longer spending every waking hour trying not to starve. You improve your shelter. Then you build better tools, then irrigation, then storage, then perhaps some primitive transport. Each investment makes the next investment easier. Productive capacity rises, surplus rises, free time rises, and the process appears to feed on itself. That is the deep appeal of compound growth. It sounds not just mathematical, but civilizational. We build, we save, we improve, and then the future becomes richer because the present laid the groundwork for it. Now let me ask the question that should bother anyone who thinks this is the whole story. If compound interest is such a powerful and reliable road to wealth, why are most people not rich? I do not mean why are they not billionaires. I mean something much more modest. If the mechanism is so available, so universal, and so mathematically beautiful, why is even basic financial security still so fragile for so many people? Are most people lazy? Are they stupid? Are they uniquely incapable of understanding what every financial influencer on the internet claims to understand? Or is the reality of how people actually live much messier than the curve on the chart? The first reason the myth breaks down is the one almost everybody leaves out. People do not save and compound for their entire lives. They move through a life cycle that matters more than most people realize. When you are very young, you are not compounding. In many cases, you are going backwards. You are studying. You may be taking on debt. You may be paying rent while building no real ownership at all. You may be surviving on low wages or family help or borrowed money. The chart does not start at comfortable zero and then move cleanly upward. For many people, it starts below zero. Then you enter your working years. This is the only section of life where the standard compound interest story really has room to operate. You earn, you save something if you can, you invest. And yes, if conditions are favorable, that accumulated wealth can begin to grow. But then life does what charts never do. You have children, your housing costs rise, your commuting costs, your food bill rises, your time shrinks, you face illnesses, accidents, family emergencies, layoffs, divorces, school fees, elderly parents, and all the other things that make a human life expensive and irregular. Then eventually you retire. And at that moment, the whole direction of the process changes. You are no longer feeding the machine. You are drawing from it. The beautiful curve that social media loves to show you is suddenly moving in reverse. The savings are no longer compounding upward untouched. They are being used to pay bills, maintain dignity, survive inflation, fund care, and cover the very real and often brutal expenses of old age. That is the life cycle reality. Most families are not climbing one smooth exponential curve all the way to the moon. They are trying to earn enough in the middle of life to fund the beginning and the end of life, both of which are structurally expensive. If you draw the actual graph of family wealth over time, it usually looks nothing like the influencer fantasy. It often begins below zero, then it rises slowly, then it gets interrupted repeatedly, then it reaches some peak late in working life, then it falls again, and by the time many ordinary people die, a great deal of what they once appeared to own has been spent simply getting through retirement and end of life care. That is not theory to me. I have seen it in my own family and in countless others. Grandparents who owned homes, grandparents who looked from the outside as though they had accumulated something real. And then the final years arrived, care, housing needs. Illness, dependence, cost after cost after cost. By the end, much of the wealth was gone. So what most people call long-term compounding is often not dynastic enrichment at all. It is life cycle smoothing. It is an attempt to build enough during one phase of life to survive the other phases without collapsing. And that leads to the second reason the simple story fails. An extraordinary number of people now have almost nothing left to save in the first place. You cannot compound what you cannot retain. If wages do not keep up with housing, food, transport, energy, childcare, and all the rest, then the problem is not that people failed to understand the power of compounding. The problem is that their margin disappeared before compounding ever had a chance to begin. That is where a great deal of financial commentary becomes morally irritating to me. It tells people to behave as though the central issue is self-control when the central issue is often arithmetic. You can lecture a family all day about discipline, but if the budget is already compressed by rent, debt, and basic survival, the amount available for compounding may be trivial or non-existent. And once you understand the life cycle problem I just described, this becomes even darker. If workers cannot save in their productive years, then they are not merely missing out on future wealth. They are reaching old age without a funded retirement. That means the future problem is not delayed comfort. It is delayed insecurity. Now I want to move from the individual to the society, because this is where the deeper contradiction appears. If compound growth is supposed to work at the social level as well, why do so many mature economies struggle to grow at all? If the productive system can keep building on itself forever, why do old economies look increasingly sluggish, unequal, and politically unstable? The answer is that the desert is land story hides the most important fact. The island has edges. A genuinely empty island can support explosive development because almost everything is available to be organized, claimed, improved, and expanded into. But over time, you use up the obvious room for expansion. The land is occupied, the rivers are claimed, the infrastructure exists. The easy gains are gone. The country is no longer a wild frontier. It is a mature, highly used, highly owned system. And when that happens, the nature of wealth accumulation changes. At the beginning of development, a great deal of investment really is additive. You are building new productive capacity, new farms, new factories, new transport lines, new tools. The pie gets larger because there is still space to enlarge it materially. But once you reach the edges of the island, a growing share of accumulation becomes less about creating entirely new capacity and more about controlling existing assets. That distinction is everything. In a finite economy, the rich can still grow their wealth rapidly, even if the society as a whole grows slowly. That sounds impossible until you understand what is happening. Suppose the economy grows at 1%. Meanwhile, large fortunes grow at 4 or 5%. Where does the difference come from? It cannot all come from new social wealth, because the whole society is not expanding that quickly. It comes increasingly from capture of land, capture of housing, capture of monopoly positions, capture of natural resources, capture of media, capture of platforms, capture of the existing asset base of society. And this is where the public becomes dangerously confused, because in the first stage of this process, the middle class often feels richer. House prices rise, stocks rise, land rises, gold rises, collectibles rise, everything with a fixed supply starts getting bid upward. And the typical household looks at that and says, wonderful, we are getting wealthier. But what is really happening is often much darker. Your class is being outbid, your children are being priced out, your community is being slowly stripped of the ability to own the asset base that earlier generations took for granted. The rising house price feels like a gift when you already own the house. But if the next generation cannot buy in, then what looks like your gain is also their exclusion. This is one of the great confusions of modern life. People celebrate the price inflation of essential assets as though it were broad prosperity. Much of the time, it is simply evidence that ownership is concentrating. I know this not just abstractly, but personally. When I made money early in my life, I faced the same question every investor faces. What do I do with the capital? In principle, one can fund genuinely productive enterprise, new ideas, new capacity, new businesses, real expansion. I tried that. Some of it failed. And not because the ideas were absurd, but because they landed in a weak economy with weak consumers. The broader demand environment was poor. The productive investments struggled. Meanwhile, the investments that simply involved buying existing assets often did extremely well. Stocks, property, gold, things already there, already owned, already part of the existing map of wealth. That experience taught me something essential about mature economies. When growth is weak and wealth is concentrated, it is often easier to make money by owning what already exists than by creating what does not yet exist. That is rational for the investor. It is disastrous for the society. Because if the wealthy can compound faster by acquiring existing claims than by building new capacity, then their growth increasingly comes at the expense of everyone else's access, security, and ownership. This is the core point I want you to understand. In finite economies, unchecked compound returns do not lift everyone. They allow large pools of capital to outbid the middle class for the existing world. That is why the rich keep compounding, even while the society struggles. That is why the asset-owning class can feel protected, while the working and middle classes become more precarious. That is why growth in billionaire wealth can coexist with stagnant wages, weak demand, housing crises, and falling living standards. At that point, compound interest stops being a universal road to freedom and becomes a mechanism through which concentrated wealth slowly cannibalizes the asset base of ordinary families. I know that sounds dramatic, but I do not think it is exaggerated. If the owners of large fortunes keep compounding at rates materially above the growth rate of the economy, then over time they will own more and more of what matters. The land, the housing, the infrastructure, the shares, the platforms, the claims on future income, the means by which everybody else must live. And once that happens, the middle class does not vanish overnight. It gets hollowed out. Its children rent instead of own. Its security weakens. Its retirement becomes less funded. Its political mood sours. Its faith in institutions decays. Its households become asset, light and cost heavy. That is not some distant science fiction scenario. That is recognizably the direction many societies are already moving. People ask why younger generations feel so anxious and angry. This is why they are being told the same old compound interest fairy tale in a world where the preconditions for broad compounding have been steadily removed. They do not lack the chart, they lack the margin, they lack affordable assets, they lack the same entry prices their parents had, they lack the same wage relationship to housing, they lack the same probability that work plus prudence leads to durable ownership. And because so many people still misread rising asset prices as a sign of collective health, they fail to see the dispossession until it is well advanced. I am reminded of the old story of Esau and Jacob. Esau comes in hungry, exhausted, desperate for immediate relief. Jacob offers him a bowl of food in exchange for his inheritance. Esau takes the deal because the inheritance feels distant and the hunger feels immediate. In the moment, the trade feels reasonable, but what he has really surrendered is not just one asset. He has surrendered the future position of his line. That is what a lot of middle-class societies are doing now. They are enjoying the temporary feeling that comes from inflated asset prices while surrendering the long-term ownership structure their children would need to remain secure. They mistake the rising paper value of the inheritance for proof that the inheritance is safe, even as the conditions that would let the next generation actually inherit ownership are eroding. And if you want to know what societies look like when the middle class becomes too small, you do not have to imagine it. You can look around the world. You see countries with large wealth at the top, weak ownership in the middle, precarious labor at the bottom, low trust, fragile and lives that are far more stressful and unstable than the glossy GDP discussions would suggest. A robust middle class is not decorative. It is the social engine of mass prosperity. It is the group that spends, owns, plans, saves, forms communities, sustains local commerce, and stabilizes democracy itself. If you let compound wealth accumulation at the top keep eating into the ownership base of that class, then eventually you do not just get inequality. You get a poorer and more brittle society. So when people tell me compound interest is the road by which everyone can get rich, my answer is simple. No, not under these conditions. Under these conditions, compound interest is how the rich keep getting richer while the middle class gets outbid. That is why the same formula that looks so innocent on an individual finance chart becomes politically explosive when you examine it at the level of the whole society. Now, I do not say this because I oppose saving or ownership or investment. Quite the opposite. I want ordinary people to own more, not less. I want more families capable of security, not fewer. But if that is the goal, then you have to stop telling yourself comforting fairy tales and start addressing the structure. The structure is the problem. If returns on wealth remain higher than the growth rate of the economy, and if existing asset ownership keeps concentrating, and if we continue taxing labor more heavily than concentrated wealth, then the process will continue. The rich will keep compounding, the middle class will keep losing relative ground, and the next generation will inherit a world with less ownership and more dependence. That is why I keep coming back to tax. If you want to stop the cannibalization of the middle class, you have to change the rules under which capital compounds. You have to reduce the tax pressure on ordinary work and increase the tax pressure on concentrated wealth. Not because success is immoral, but because an economy in which large fortunes permanently compound faster than society can grow is not an economy producing shared prosperity. It is an economy concentrating ownership until the social fabric frays. That is the real fight. Not whether compound interest exists. It does. Not whether compounding can create wealth. It can. The real question is who gets to benefit from compounding, under what conditions, and at whose expense. The people already rich enough to own meaningful assets can still benefit enormously. The ordinary worker trying to begin late, with high costs, low margins, and a fully priced asset market often cannot, and that is why the promise feels broken. So let me end as plainly as I can. Compound interest is not a universal ladder out of poverty. In a mature, finite, unequal economy, it becomes a sorting machine. It rewards those who already own. It punishes those who must buy late. It flatters the middle class with rising asset prices while quietly pushing the next generation out of the ownership game. And if we do nothing about that, we will not get a society in which everybody patiently saves their way to security. We will get a society in which concentrated wealth keeps eating the middle class. And once you see that clearly, a lot of modern financial advice starts to look less like wisdom and more like anesthesia. It soothes you. It individualizes a structural problem. It tells a worker in a shrinking ownership economy that the answer is better habits, when the deeper answer is that the whole ownership map has been tilted against them. Good habits still matter, prudence still matters, patience still matters. But without structural change, those virtues increasingly operate inside a game rigged toward existing capital. That is not inevitable. But it is where the current rules point change the tax system. Tax concentrated wealth more seriously. Tax ordinary work less. Slow the machine that lets enormous fortunes outgrow the society that sustains them. That is how you protect the middle class. That is how you protect your children from inheriting less. And that is how you stop a beautiful mathematical idea from becoming a social disaster. Take care of yourself and send this to somebody who still thinks the answer is just to skip one more coffee and wait for the curve to save them.